Now, Jerry indicated that I went to Whitfield Theological Seminary and I wrote a book called Before Jerusalem Fell. Before Jerusalem Fell is my doctoral dissertation, which was written on this subject. And it was over 400 pages of argument. I'm not going to give you all those pages of argument tonight. You will be able to go home. I think that's why he's got the heat turned up so hot in here. So we'll make sure we don't stay here too long. Well, what evidence is it that persuades the scholars to adopt either the early date or the late date? Well, basically, there are two types of evidence that are available to us. There are what's called external evidence and internal evidence. External evidence looks outside the book to church tradition and the early church fathers to see what this father or that father said about it. That's external. That's tradition. Internal evidence goes into the book of Revelation to see what John is saying and trying to discern from what John says what the date of the book should be. They look at his allusions and his direct statements and say, oh, here he's speaking of this event which must have been dated at that time, etc. Well, I want us to only very briefly consider the external evidence, and I'll only give a couple of samples from the external evidence, and then I'm going to focus the remainder of our time on the internal evidence. I believe the internal evidence is more important because it takes what John is saying and interprets John's declarations rather than waiting 100 or 200 or 300 years for some church father to make a declaration about it. And so I will be looking just briefly at the external evidence, and then we'll look at the internal evidence. And so let's begin with the external evidence. Now, all would agree that Irenaeus is an important church father and that he makes an important statement about the book of Revelation and its date. Now, Irenaeus is important because he lived and wrote in 180. Now, notice that's only about 100 years or so after either one of these views on the dating of Revelation. So he lived very early in church history. He knows some of the disciples of John the Apostle. He claims to have known Polycarp, who was a disciple of John the Apostle. And he makes a direct statement regarding the date of the book of Revelation, or at least so it seems, in his book called Against Heresies. And so, whichever side of the issue you come down on, you're going to have to reckon with Irenaeus. Irenaeus' statement is given not to tell us something about the book of Revelation directly, but he's actually dealing with the name of the Antichrist. That's his main purpose. Let's notice what he says here and consider it carefully. I want us to look at it. And you can see why the late date advocate who believes John wrote under Domitian rather than the early date advocate who believes he wrote under Nero, you can see why the late date advocate would see Irenaeus' statement as being so important. Irenaeus says, quote, "We will not, however, incur the risk of pronouncing positively as to the name of Antichrist. For if it were necessary that his name should be distinctly revealed in the present time, it would have been announced by him who beheld the apocalyptic vision. For that was seen no very long time ago, but almost in our day towards the end of Domitian's reign." Now notice here that he says, he's talking about the Antichrist. Who is the Antichrist? And his argument is going to be, we don't know. John does not tell us who the Antichrist was, and he says it in this way. It would have been announced by him who beheld the apocalyptic vision, for that was seen no very long time ago, but almost in our day towards the end of Domitian's reign. Well, so you can see that its value for the late date argument. Irenaeus says it was written, or it appears he's saying, it was written almost in our day at the end of Domitian's reign. But there are problems, and I want to list three. The problem of translation, the problem of transition, and the problem of attestation. First is a problem of translation. Greek is what's called an inflected language. You can have a verb all by itself without a pronoun or noun with it, and the noun idea or the pronoun idea is contained in the Greek verb itself. That being so, his statement, "For that was seen no very long time ago," can be either it was seen, the book of Revelation was seen, or he was seen. Irenaeus can be saying either the book of Revelation was seen by the Apostle John not long ago in Domitian's reign, or it can be translated to say he who wrote the Revelation was seen not long ago in Domitian's reign. And so the issue is, when someone brings out Irenaeus, we have to recognize there's a problem. We don't know if he's saying it was seen or he was seen. Revelation was seen or John was seen. So you see a problem there. Secondly, the problem of transition. He uses the word "for," which is a transitional word. He uses the word "for" when he says, "It would have been announced by him who beheld the apocalyptic vision, for that was seen no very long time ago." Now, what does he mean "for" by that? Well, what I think he's doing here is he's referring back to his main idea. His main idea is John did not tell us who the Antichrist was. And so it would seem that this "for" makes us look back to the statement that John didn't tell us who the Antichrist was. And so the "for" suggests that it should be he who was seen rather than that which was seen or it was seen. And so this tells us that it would have been announced by him who beheld the apocalyptic vision, for he was seen not very long ago. You see how that fits very nicely. That "for" makes us see that Irenaeus is dealing with the issue of John himself and not the issue of the book of Revelation's writing. And then thirdly, attestation. When you read Irenaeus, you'll find that he is very emphatic on trying to trace doctrines back to the apostles. He'll say Apostle John talked to Apostle Polycarp, and Polycarp talked to this person, and I talked to him, so that he can trace and link his doctrines back to the apostles through this mechanism. And so he's interested in the living witness, the living voice of the church. He's saying, in effect, I know so-and-so who knew John, and that's where I got my information from. Well, even here he's doing that. Notice that he says, John would have announced, it would have been announced by him who beheld the apocalyptic vision. See, he's interested in John's announcement that is being passed on. Okay? Now, so he's saying something about the living witness. If Irenaeus is used by the late date advocate, then we have to recognize that when he refers to the living witness going back in time, he sometimes is fundamentally wrong. For instance, in Against Heresies, Book 2, Chapter 22, Paragraph 5, he says that he had heard from the apostles through their disciples to the present time, he had heard that Jesus had a 15-year ministry and he died about the age 50. Now, I think even maybe you don't know all the implications of dating in the New Testament, but I think you all know that Jesus probably died sometime around 30, 33 years old, thereabouts. And for Irenaeus to use this argument of the living witness of the church to affirm that Christ had a 15-year ministry, not a 3-year ministry, and that he lived to be 50 instead of living to be 33 or thereabouts, I think you can see that there's a problem with this. And so the main argument for the late date rests on Irenaeus. But Irenaeus is a faulty reed to lean upon. Well, what kind of external evidence does the early date have? Well, we could bring out Clement of Alexandria. Irenaeus lived in 180 and wrote in 180. Clement of Alexandria wrote in 200. In his Miscellanies, chapter 7, he says, and notice what he says, the teaching of our Lord at his advent, beginning with Augustus and Tiberius, was completed in the middle of the times of Tiberius. And that of the apostles ends with Nero. Nero died in the year 68. He says the apostles' ministry ended with Nero. Nero died in 68. Well, interestingly, Clement of Alexandria, in another book, which is called Who is the Rich Man, chapter 42, he says that John is the author of Revelation. So then, what you have here is, he says the apostles' ministry ceased under Nero. We know that Nero died in 68. He says that John wrote Revelation, which means John wrote Revelation before Nero died, which means that John wrote Revelation well before 70.